Okay, let's talk about Diablo 4 from a casual player's perspective. This past weekend was the free open beta, so it was the best opportunity to hop in and see what the game has to offer, and I spent my weekend playing a couple of classes just to really get a feel for everything that is Diablo 4. And I'll admit, I was a bit skeptical of Diablo 4 because of obviously Diablo Immortal, as well as the numerous controversies and lawsuits impacting Blizzard at the moment, potentially affecting development, and more importantly, the gameplay trailers and the game dev showcases just were really not selling the game to me. My main concerns from watching the gameplay trailers were that the animation seemed clunky and slow, the gameplay loop just wasn't really apparent to me, and looking into the details from other players during the closed beta, I had concerns about the pared down skill trees, which really seemed like a downgrade from Diablo 3. There was issues with monetization as well as the pricing of the game, and this last one's kind of personal preference, but I'm fine in theory with the return to darker aesthetics, but I was pretty okay with Diablo 3 being cartoonish and colorful, but the trailer specifically seemed very grayed and washed out, so I was worried about the game being very visually bland. With that being said, the Diablo 4 cinematic trailers, by 3 they come especially, was chilling and dramatic, and in hindsight it was a perfect tone setter for Diablo 4. However, with most Blizzard cinematics, they're always very high quality, very polished, and sometimes they can raise expectations too high, as they're not always representative of the game. However, I was happily surprised, and this turned out to be not the case. As I mentioned, from the first closed beta, I watched some gameplay and I still had some concerns about the animations looking clunky, as well as the colors still looking washed out. And the gameplay loop was a little bit clearer, but it still seems like it lacked a lot of longevity. And I think I'm simply in a Diablo 3 mindset, and we'll get into that a little bit later. And you might be saying to yourself, well, that's a stupid thing to say. Diablo 3 is a different game entirely, and you'd be right. So that's why I wanted to give it a shot this weekend. I think my mindset with being, going in was simply D3 has existed for such a long time, and now they've worked out a lot of kinks and bugs and learned a lot from the development over the life cycle of that game. And to throw it all away, that working formula seems like such a waste. But regardless, jumping into Diablo 4 this weekend, the time I spent with it, I really enjoyed it. My first note, hopping in, you have to make your character, and the character customization seems quite fun, if not just a little bit basic for a really high quality game. But you don't really see your character all that often, so it's really not that big of a deal, and it's more than we've had in the past, so I'll take it. My second note was, despite it sharing similarities with Lost Ark and seemingly borrowing that formula and gameplay style, I think the Diablo 4 team did a much more successful job with their implementation. And that's because when I played Lost Ark, I became disinterested after a few hours, despite the beautiful visuals and the fun combat, but I really felt disconnected to the story and was really playing it because my friends were playing it at the time. What I felt like I was just participating in a journey that was already laid out for me, and rather than my personal exploration and involvement with the story, whereas with Diablo 4, the story was more engaging and it felt like I was the center of the story, as I wasn't really railroaded into following this specific path, even though I was. Also, the story didn't feel like it was overstaying its welcome. It was frequent enough to keep you engaged, but it also didn't force or interrupt your combat too often, so that you felt like you were just listening to story. Diablo 4 storytelling so far feels very strong. The darker themes and the aesthetics were cohesive both between the gameplay as well as the cutscenes and the NPCs, and I'm not usually one for body horror or creepy and dark things, but altogether it was very thrilling and interesting. I'm really looking forward to seeing where the story heads next, and if I'm being honest, I think I would be satisfied paying for the game just to see where the story ends up. And I think that's another differentiator between Diablo 4 and Lost Ark, was that they have such a deep lore and pool of history to pull from, where we're getting to really interact with a lot of elements from Sanctuary and characters that we know by name, but never interacted with before. So we're getting to really put our hands around and understand this world a lot better. As I got further into the gameplay, I didn't really notice the simple skill tree as much as I thought I would, and similarly, I wasn't as bored with the visuals as I remember thinking I might be when I was watching the gameplay trailers about, how gray everything was and how washed out it was going to be. But playing through it, you don't really notice it that much. And there was a little bit more visual interest than I thought there was. There is a little bit more color, and those things really pop when there is that little bit of color. But another thing that you do end up noticing is that every inch of your screen is really filled with a lot of detail. I remember just descending in one of these dungeons, going down a bunch of ruins, and I noticed all of these creepy tendrils that were just kind of twitching. And I remember thinking, oh, that's so disgusting. But at the same time, it was very cool and really added to the atmosphere that you were running through this creepy dungeon. Combat was very fluid and engaging, and perhaps maybe a side benefit of the simplified skill tree is that it seemed pretty easy to put a build together that works, just using a little bit of common sense. But take it with a grain of salt, this was only with a little bit limited amount of experience, and I only played with the druid and the sorcerer. For the most part, I did enjoy the combat. At some points, the difficulty felt like it was a little too easy, even though I was playing on the highest setting that they had available for the beta. So I'm looking forward to upping the difficulty once those are available in the full game. But even as a casual player, it felt a little bit easy. But at the same time, the bosses and elites could also feel a little bit spongy in terms of their health pools. And I can see this being intentional for bosses where you want to demonstrate mechanics and draw the fight out a little bit longer so that you can have those little intense moments of combat. But I think you're supposed to leverage the dodge mechanic, but for the most part, my entire weekend, the dodge mechanic always felt clunky. It never felt like it was the option, except until I was like in really dire straits. And maybe that's just my play style, but hopefully that mechanic just becomes a little bit more natural and intuitive. Another note regarding the gameplay and the combat is that sometimes I just wish there was a little bit more mob density, or that there were just more mob packs in the map. Sometimes I was just traveling between areas of the map and was wishing I would encounter some enemies. I also just really enjoyed the combat, so I had this fantasy of, slaying a large horde of enemies. And maybe that's just because of my experience with Diablo 3. And enjoying games like Dynasty Warriors, but maybe there is some middle ground and we can split the difference. But maybe that's also unfair to expect from Diablo 4. Another element that stood out for me in Diablo 4 was the itemization. Overall, it seems fine. The overall stat sheet seems much more simpler than Diablo 3. However, I felt like there was just a lack of understanding on my part of the systems. For example, there were things like lucky hit chance and item level power. While I understand them in concept and what those words mean individually, it was difficult to understand how they impact my damage, as well as how stats impact your overall recovery and damage and things like that. I just feel like I didn't grasp it very intuitively. And also for a lot of the uniques or legendaries, I felt like I wasn't really sure how to value them. For example, what I mean, I don't know if I should expect them to have higher stats than regular items, and I don't know if they have only a certain number of powers they can pull from. Like, should certain items dropped by certain bosses have certain powers? Just prioritizing those things, or if you're trying to build a certain kit, should you be rolling on certain items or things like that? It just left a lot of questions in my mind. Uniques were pretty easy to get, although they didn't seem like they would change your gameplay all too much. There would be an occasional unique that had an additional power, but for the most part, they mostly didn't seem like they were adding anything super dramatic. So I'm just really looking forward to understanding that system a little bit better. And I suppose for right now, this did make the gameplay feel a little bit fresh and exciting because you didn't really know everything and you were actively discovering new information as you collected uniques and things like that. So it was really trial and error, but at the same time, there is a part of you that wonders if you're underperforming or gimping yourself, essentially, if you're not rolling or selecting the right builds and items. So all in all, I'm actually really excited for Diablo 4. I think I'll certainly be waiting to make my decision for purchase, whether it's going to be any of those deluxe editions, because I'm not really sure about those price points at the moment, that the extras don't really seem worth it to me. But I think in terms of Diablo 4 content, I think we've only scratched the surface. So I'm really looking forward to them putting out more information so we get a better understanding of the longevity and the actual content for the rest of the game. As it stands, the maps look absolutely enormous, and it looks like there's going to be a lot of story as well as character levels to progress through. So I really look forward to reviewing the game once it's out. So keep an eye out for that. In my last video about Diablo 3, there were some people saying that they were really excited about Diablo 4, but I expressed that I was a little bit more hesitant. I hadn't completely bought in yet on the hype, but playing in the beta this weekend, Diablo 4 really squashed a lot of my original hesitations and hangups. I think for a casual player like myself, Diablo 4 is going to be a great game, and I'm really looking forward to playing it once it's fully released. If you are able to play in either of the betas, I would love to hear what your experience was like down in the comments below. And I just want to say an absolute huge thank you for watching. I really appreciate it. And if you've liked and subscribed this to my channel, even bigger thank you. But with all of that being said, I'm Lumo, and until next time, take care.